What would you do? If you found a positive pregnancy test in your husband's car while you're already 7 months pregnant for Sarah Mitchell, that single discovery shattered everything. Her picture-perfect marriage. The charming, successful husband she thought she knew. At first, it looked like an affair, but then strange medical records in her name, appointments she never made, a nurse who wasn't really a nurse. The deeper she dug, the darker it got. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated scheme, one so twisted, it will make you question everyone you trust. And if you're ready to uncover Sarah's nightmare, piece by piece, hit that like button now. Subscribe for more stories that keep you on edge, and let's dive in. Sarah Mitchell stood in the marble-floored garage of their Boston penthouse, staring at the small pink box tucked behind the driver's seat of David's BMW. Her 7 months pregnant belly pressed against the car door as she reached for what was unmistakably a pregnancy test. But it wasn't hers. The test showed 2 clear lines. Positive. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the box, finding a receipt dated 3 days ago. Her mind raced through the possibilities, each one more devastating than the last. She was already carrying David's child, due in just 2 months. Whose test was this? The sound of the elevator ascending made her quickly shove the box into her purse. David's voice echoed in the hallway, speaking to someone on the phone with his usual commanding tone. The Vermont property is perfect for what we discussed. Complete privacy. No neighbors for miles. Sarah waddled quickly toward the kitchen, her heart pounding. David appeared moments later, his 6-foot frame filling the doorway. Even at 38, he maintained the athletic build that had first attracted her during her nursing residency. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate despite the late hour. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, crossing to kiss her forehead. The gesture felt mechanical, practiced. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," Sarah managed, studying his face for any telltale signs of deception. "You're home late again." "Big deal closing tomorrow. You know how it is in real estate." David moved to the refrigerator, helping himself to sparkling water. "Dr. Peterson called. He wants to see you again next week about those blood pressure readings." Sarah nodded. Though she hadn't heard from their obstetrician, David had been increasingly involved in her medical care, often taking calls she never received. At first, she'd attributed it to his protective nature. Now, everything felt suspicious. "David, whose pregnancy test is in your car?" The question escaped before she could stop it. David's hand paused on the water bottle, just for a split second. Then he turned, his expression shifting to concern. "What are you talking about? Sweetheart, are you feeling all right?" "There's a positive pregnancy test in your BMW, behind the driver's seat." David set down his water and approached her with the careful movements of someone dealing with a volatile situation. "Sarah, you're 7 months pregnant. You're probably just confused. The stress of the pregnancy, the hormones. Dr. Peterson warned us about this. I know what I saw. Show me." They walked to the garage together. Sarah reached for her purse, but the box was gone. She frantically searched through the contents while David watched patiently. "It was right here. I put it in my purse." "Honey, there's nothing there." David's voice carried a note of gentle concern that made her feel like she was losing her mind. "Maybe you dreamed it. You've been having such vivid dreams lately." Sarah stared into her empty purse, doubt creeping in. Had she imagined it? The pregnancy had been difficult, filled with complications that kept her confined to their home. The isolation was getting to her, making her paranoid about David's increasingly frequent business trips. "I think you should call Dr. Peterson in the morning," David said, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. These kinds of delusions can be serious during pregnancy. The word delusions hit her like a physical blow. Sarah looked at her husband's concerned face, searching for any hint of deception. But David had always been good at controlling his expressions. It was part of what made him so successful in business. "Maybe you're right," she whispered, though every instinct screamed otherwise. That night, as David slept peacefully beside her, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. The pregnancy test had been real. She was certain of it. But if David was having an affair with someone else who was pregnant, what did that mean for her and their unborn daughter? She thought about the Vermont property David had mentioned on the phone. They owned a cabin there, inherited from his family. David had suggested they spend the final weeks of her pregnancy there for peace and quiet. Now, that suggestion took on a more sinister tone. As the clock struck midnight, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would find the truth, no matter what it cost her. Sarah waited until David left for his morning meeting before beginning her search, moving slowly due to her advanced pregnancy. She methodically went through his home office, looking for anything that might explain the mysterious pregnancy test. His desk drawers revealed nothing unusual: business cards, contracts, the typical detritus of a successful real estate mogul. But when she opened his laptop, she discovered it was password protected with a code she didn't recognize. David had always shared everything with her before. The house phone rang, startling her from her investigation. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Dr. Peterson's office. We need to reschedule your appointment for next week." Sarah frowned. "I wasn't aware I had an appointment scheduled." A pause. "Your husband called yesterday to set it up. He was concerned about some symptoms you've been experiencing." "What symptoms?" Another pause, longer this time. "Perhaps you should speak with your husband about this, Mrs. Mitchell." After hanging up, Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. David was making medical appointments without telling her, discussing symptoms she hadn't reported. The pregnancy test was just the beginning. She moved to David's dresser, searching through his clothes with growing desperation. In the pocket of a jacket she'd never seen him wear, she found a credit card statement for an account she didn't know existed. The charges made her blood run cold: hotel rooms, expensive dinners for two, jewelry purchases from Tiffany, all dated over the past 4 months, while she'd been confined to bed rest. But it was the final charge that stopped her heart. New England Fertility Clinic, 2847. Sarah sank into the bedroom chair, the statement trembling in her hands. David wasn't just having an affair. He was trying to get his mistress pregnant while his wife carried his child. The sound of the garage door opening sent her into a panic. She quickly replaced the statement and returned to the living room, grabbing a pregnancy book to appear occupied. David entered with an expression she'd never seen before, cold calculation masked by false warmth. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" "Better. Actually, I think you were right about the stress affecting me." "Good. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I'd like Dr. Peterson to see you sooner rather than later. I've arranged for him to come here this afternoon." Sarah's pulse quickened. "That's not necessary. I can go to his office. I don't want you exerting yourself. Besides, I've already arranged everything." The way he said "arranged everything" sent chills down her spine. Sarah realized she was no longer David's wife. She was a problem to be managed. "I spoke to my mother as well," David continued. "She agrees that you've been acting strangely lately. The paranoid thoughts, the confusion about things that didn't happen. Your mother," Sarah couldn't hide her shock, Carol Mitchell had never shown anything but polite disinterest in her son's wife. "What did you tell her?" "Just that the pregnancy is taking a toll on your mental state. She's offered to help however she can." Sarah nodded mutely, but inside, she was screaming. David was systematically building a case that she was mentally unstable. The appointment with Dr. Peterson, the conversation with his mother, it was all designed to create a paper trail. When David left again, claiming another urgent meeting, Sarah called her brother Jake. They hadn't spoken in months due to a fight over David, but Jake was an investigative journalist. If anyone could help her uncover the truth, it was him. "Sarah, is everything okay?" "Jake, I need your help. I think David is having an affair, and I think he's trying to make me look crazy." A long pause. "That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have?" Sarah told him about the pregnancy test, the credit card statement, the medical appointments she hadn't made. Jake listened without interruption. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "But Sarah, you need to be careful. If David is as manipulative as you think, confronting him directly could be dangerous. I'm scared, Jake. I feel like I'm losing my mind, but I know what I saw. Trust your instincts. I'll call you tomorrow with whatever I find." That afternoon, Dr. Peterson arrived as scheduled, but instead of the kind, elderly physician who had delivered half of Boston's elite babies, she was greeted by a younger man she'd never seen before. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Harrison. Dr. Peterson asked me to see you today due to some concerns about your mental state during pregnancy." Sarah's world began to spin. Even her doctor had been replaced. She was trapped in a web of David's making, and she was running out of time to escape. Dr. Harrison's examination felt more like an interrogation. He asked probing questions about her mental state, her relationship with reality, and her paranoid episodes regarding David's fidelity. Every answer Sarah gave seemed to be cataloged as evidence against her. "Your husband mentioned you've been having delusions about pregnancy tests and secret affairs," Dr. Harrison said, making notes on his tablet. "These kinds of paranoid ideations are more common than you might think during high-risk pregnancies." "They're not delusions," Sarah insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. David's gaslighting was working. "I'm going to prescribe something mild to help with the anxiety, and I think it would be beneficial if you spent the remainder of your pregnancy somewhere peaceful, away from stressors." After the doctor left, David appeared with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Dr. Harrison thinks the Vermont cabin would be perfect for you. Clean air, no distractions, and I can work remotely to keep an eye on you." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The Vermont property isolated. No cell service, no neighbors for miles. The perfect place to make someone disappear. "I don't want to go to Vermont." "It's not really a choice anymore. Sweetheart, Dr. Harrison is concerned about your state of mind. If you won't voluntarily seek help, there are other options." The threat was clear. Submit to exile in Vermont, or face involuntary commitment. "When do we leave?" Sarah asked, defeat creeping into her voice. "Tomorrow morning. I've already arranged for a nurse to help with your care." That night, Sarah tried to call Jake, but her phone had no signal. When she checked the landline, it was dead. David had systematically cut off her communication with the outside world. She spent the night packing, slipping the credit card statement into her suitcase. It was the only evidence she had, and she prayed it would be enough to prove her sanity when the time came. The next morning, David loaded their car with efficiency that suggested careful planning. The drive to Vermont took 3 hours, during which Sarah watched the civilization disappear behind them. By the time they reached the cabin, she felt like she was being transported to another planet. The Mitchell family cabin sat on 50 acres of pristine wilderness. It had always been David's favorite retreat, but now it felt like a prison. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and cell service was non-existent. "Isn't this perfect?" David said, helping her out of the car. "Just what you need to recover." A sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway behind them. Sarah expected to see an elderly, matronly nurse emerge. Instead, a stunning young woman with platinum blonde hair and designer clothes stepped out. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Amber Hayes. She's a specialized nurse who works with high-risk pregnancies and psychological complications." Amber extended a perfectly manicured hand. "It's so nice to meet you. Sarah, I've heard so much about you." There was something in Amber's smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. This woman was too young, too beautiful, and too familiar with David to be a legitimate nurse. "I'll show you to your room," Amber continued, taking Sarah's arm with practiced gentleness. "You must be exhausted from the journey." As Amber led her into the cabin, Sarah caught a glimpse of David and the woman exchanging a look that confirmed her worst fears. Amber wasn't just David's mistress, she was his co-conspirator. The bedroom Amber showed her to was on the second floor, with windows that had been recently fitted with security locks. The door had a new deadbolt that could only be opened from the outside. "For your safety," Amber explained when she saw Sarah staring at the lock. "We wouldn't want you wandering around at night in your condition." "You're not a nurse," Sarah said quietly. Amber's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "I'm whatever David needs me to be." That evening, as Sarah lay in her locked room, listening to David and Amber talking softly downstairs, she realized the full scope of their plan. David wasn't just trying to drive her crazy. He was setting up the perfect scenario to take everything from her: her child, her money, her freedom. The pregnancy test hadn't belonged to Amber at all. It had been a prop, designed to make Sarah paranoid and start her down the path of apparent mental illness. Every step since then had been choreographed to build a case for her incompetence. But knowing their plan and stopping it were two different things. Sarah was trapped in an isolated cabin with her husband and his mistress, 7 months pregnant and with no way to contact the outside world. As contractions began rippling across her abdomen, Sarah realized that time was running out faster than she'd thought. Her daughter was coming early, and whatever David and Amber had planned for the birth, it wasn't going to end well for either mother or child. Sarah's contractions started at 3 a.m, sharp pains that woke her from restless sleep. She'd been through enough prenatal classes to know these weren't Braxton Hicks, her daughter was coming, 2 months early. She pounded on the bedroom door, calling for help. After several minutes, Amber appeared, looking perfectly composed despite being awakened in the middle of the night. "What's wrong?" Amber asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "I'm in labor. I need to get to a hospital." "Let me check." Amber pulled out her phone, frowning at the screen. "No signal up here. David's gone into town for supplies. He won't be back until morning." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "Then drive me yourself. My baby is coming." "I don't think that's wise in your condition. Early labor can last for hours. Let's wait and see how things develop." Another contraction hit, stronger this time. Sarah doubled over, gripping the doorframe. When it passed, she looked at Amber with growing understanding. "You're not going to help me, are you?" "Of course I am. But panicking won't help anyone. Why don't you lie down and try to rest?" Sarah knew that lying down was the last thing she should do. She needed to stay mobile, to keep active, to help the labor progress safely. Amber's advice was designed to complicate the delivery. "I need to walk," Sarah said, pushing past Amber into the hallway. I really think bed rest is better. I'm a nurse practitioner, Sarah snapped. I know more about childbirth than you do. Amber's mask slipped again, revealing irritation. David said you were a difficult patient. Sarah made it to the kitchen before another contraction hit. This one was stronger, closer. Her baby was definitely coming, whether they were ready or not. She grabbed the landline phone, but it was still dead. David had made sure she had no way to call for help. Where are the car keys? Sarah demanded. David has them with him. All of them. Amber hesitated just long enough to reveal she was lying. Yes, all of them. Sarah began searching drawers frantically, looking for any set of keys. In the third drawer, she found David's spare keyring. Amber lunged for it, but Sarah was faster despite her pregnancy. Give me those keys. Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly. You and David are trying to kill my baby. Sarah made it to the garage before another massive contraction stopped her. She leaned against David's BMW, breathing through the pain. When it passed, she realized she was too far along to drive safely. The contractions were coming every 3 minutes now. Amber appeared in the garage doorway. Please, come back inside. Let me help you. The only help I need is a hospital. That's not possible right now, but I do have medical training. I can deliver the baby safely. Sarah laughed bitterly. Your medical training consists of whatever David taught you about making me disappear. Another contraction, stronger than all the others. Sarah's water broke, flooding the garage floor. Her daughter was coming now, whether she wanted it or not. Amber approached slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Sarah, whether you trust me or not, I'm the only help you have right now. Let me assist with the delivery. Sarah looked into Amber's eyes, searching for any sign of genuine concern. What she saw instead was cold calculation. This woman wasn't interested in saving Sarah or her baby. She was interested in controlling the situation. Stay away from me. Sarah stumbled back into the house, heading for the bathroom. If she was going to give birth without medical help, she needed a clean, safe space. Amber followed at a distance, no longer pretending to be helpful. In the bathroom, Sarah began gathering towels and searching for anything that could be used to cut an umbilical cord. Another contraction hit, and she realized her daughter was crowning. I need you to call 911. Sarah gasped. I told you, there's no signal. Then drive to town and get help. I can't leave you alone in labor. You're not helping anyway. Amber pulled out her phone again, but instead of calling for help, she began recording video. Sarah realized with horror that David and Amber weren't just trying to take her baby. They were documenting her apparent mental breakdown for future use in court. Stop recording me, Sarah demanded. I need to document your condition for the doctors. Another massive contraction hit, and Sarah felt her daughter's head emerge. One more push, and her baby would be born. But she was terrified of what would happen next. If Amber was willing to let them both die in childbirth, having the baby in her hands would give her ultimate power. But Sarah had no choice. Her daughter was coming, and she had to focus on bringing her safely into the world, regardless of what happened afterward. With a final push, her daughter was born. Sarah's daughter entered the world in a rush of blood and amniotic fluid, her tiny cry echoing off the bathroom walls. Despite being 2 months premature, she was breathing on her own and appeared healthy. Sarah gathered her daughter against her chest, tears streaming down her face. After months of fear and manipulation, holding her child felt like the first real moment she'd experienced in ages. She's beautiful, Amber said from the doorway, still recording everything on her phone. "Stop filming and help me," Sarah snapped. "I need something to clamp the umbilical cord." Amber finally put away her phone and knelt beside them. She produced medical scissors and clamps from her purse supplies she'd clearly brought for this purpose. "You knew this was going to happen," Sarah realized. "You knew I was going to go into early labor." "David mentioned you'd been having contractions." "I haven't been having contractions until tonight." Amber's hands were skilled and efficient as she clamped and cut the umbilical cord. Whatever else she was, she did have genuine medical training. "We need to get to a hospital," Sarah said, clutching her daughter closer. "She's premature. She needs to be monitored. David will be back soon. He'll know what to do." Sarah tried to stand, but she was weak from the delivery. Amber made no move to help her. "Bring me some towels and call for an ambulance." "I told you, there's no signal here." "Then drive into town yourself. I can't leave you and the baby alone." Sarah stared at Amber, finally understanding the full scope of the trap. "You're not going to let us leave, are you?" Before Amber could answer, the sound of a car in the driveway announced David's return. Sarah heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then he appeared in the bathroom doorway. "Well," he said, looking at Sarah holding their newborn daughter. "This is unexpected." "David, we need to get to a hospital immediately. She's premature." David knelt beside them, but instead of showing concern for his daughter, he was studying Sarah's face. "How are you feeling? Any unusual thoughts or behaviors?" The question was clearly for Amber's benefit. They were building their case even in this moment. "I'm feeling like my daughter needs medical attention." "Of course she does." "Amber, would you please take the baby so Sarah can clean up?" "No," Sarah said, holding her daughter tighter. "I'm not letting go of her." "Sarah, be reasonable. You're exhausted and covered in blood. Let Amber help." "Amber isn't a real nurse." David sighed deeply, exchanging a meaningful look with Amber. "The paranoid delusions are getting worse. Dr. Harrison warned us about this." Sarah watched in horror as they performed their choreographed routine. David's concern was entirely manufactured, designed to make her appear unstable while he appeared to be the caring husband dealing with his mentally ill wife. "I'm not delusional," Sarah said, but even she could hear how desperate she sounded. "Of course you are, sweetheart. The stress of the pregnancy, the isolation, the early labor, it's all taken a toll on your mental state." Amber stepped forward. "Sarah, let me take the baby while David helps you to bed. You need to rest." "I need a hospital." "We all need to stay calm," David said in his most soothing voice. "I've already called Dr. Harrison. He's on his way." Sarah knew that if Dr. Harrison arrived and found her in this state, holding her newborn daughter while covered in blood and making accusations about conspiracies, it would be easy to paint her as dangerously unstable. "David, please. Our daughter needs immediate medical attention. Whatever you're planning, she doesn't deserve to suffer for it." For just a moment, David's mask slipped. Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Not love for his child, but annoyance at the complication she represented. "Give Amber the baby. Sarah." "No. Give her the baby, or I'll take her from you." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah looked at her tiny daughter, so vulnerable and dependent on her protection. If she fought David physically, the baby could be hurt. If she gave in, she might never hold her daughter again. "Promise me you'll take her to a hospital." "I promise to do what's best for her." It wasn't the promise Sarah wanted, but she had no choice. With trembling hands, she passed her daughter to Amber. The moment the baby left her arms, Sarah felt like a piece of her soul had been torn away. Amber held the infant with practiced skill, but there was no warmth in her touch. "There," David said with satisfaction. "Now everyone can relax." But Sarah couldn't relax. She watched Amber holding her daughter and realized this had been the plan all along. David didn't just want to destroy Sarah. He wanted to replace her entirely with a younger, more controllable version. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now you get the help you need," David said. "And our daughter gets the stable home she deserves." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. They weren't just taking her baby. They were taking her entire future as a mother. As if on cue, headlights appeared in the driveway. Dr. Harrison had arrived to complete their carefully orchestrated scene. Dr. Harrison entered the cabin carrying a medical bag and accompanied by two men Sarah didn't recognize. They were dressed in white uniforms that looked official but somehow wrong, more like security guards than medical personnel. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you've had quite an eventful evening," Dr. Harrison said, his tone professionally concerned but detached. Sarah was still sitting on the bathroom floor, still covered in blood from the delivery. She knew how she must look, wild-haired, exhausted, and desperate, exactly how David and Amber needed her to look. "My daughter needs medical attention," Sarah said. "She was born 2 months premature." Dr. Harrison glanced at Amber, who was holding the baby with practiced ease. "The infant appears to be breathing normally. Birth weight approximately 4 pounds, Amber responded. "Strong heartbeat, good color, responsive to stimuli." Sarah stared at Amber in amazement. She was speaking with medical precision that suggested far more training than she'd admitted to having. "Dr. Harrison," Sarah said, struggling to stand. "I need to take my daughter to a hospital. She needs to be in a neonatal intensive care unit." "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm more concerned about your mental state right now. Your husband tells me you've been experiencing severe paranoid delusions." "The only delusion is thinking my husband cares about our child's welfare." Dr. Harrison made a note on his clipboard. "David mentioned you've been making unfounded accusations about affairs and conspiracies. Now you're showing signs of postpartum psychosis?" "I gave birth an hour ago. How can I have postpartum psychosis already?" "The condition can manifest very quickly, especially in high-risk pregnancies with pre-existing mental health issues." Sarah realized they had an answer for everything. Every rational concern she raised would be twisted into evidence of her instability. "I want to speak to my brother," Sarah said. "Jake Reynolds. He's a journalist." "We tried to reach him," David interjected. "He expressed concern about your mental state as well." "That's not true." "Sarah, Jake told me you'd been calling him with increasingly paranoid theories about our marriage. He suggested professional help." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Even Jake, her last potential ally, had apparently been turned against her. Either David was lying, or her brother had betrayed her. Dr. Harrison approached with a syringe. "I'm going to give you something to help you relax. Mrs. Mitchell, I don't want any medication. I'm breastfeeding. Given your current mental state, breastfeeding isn't advisable." The two men in white uniforms moved closer, ready to restrain her if necessary. Sarah looked around the bathroom, desperately searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Please," she whispered, looking at her daughter in Amber's arms. "Please don't do this." "We're doing what's best for everyone," David said. "Especially for her." The injection stung, and within seconds Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to fade. Through the growing haze, she watched Amber carry her daughter out of the bathroom. "Wait," Sarah tried to call, but her voice was barely a whisper. "She'll be well cared for." "Dr. Harrison said. "The infant will be taken to Boston Children's Hospital for evaluation and monitoring." Sarah tried to ask if she could go too, but the words wouldn't form. The sedative was pulling her under, and the last thing she saw was David watching her with cold satisfaction. When she woke, Sarah was in a hospital bed, but not at Boston Children's. The walls were institutional green, and the windows had security mesh. Through her drug-induced fog, she realized she was in a psychiatric facility. A nurse she didn't recognize was checking her IV drip. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. How are you feeling?" "Where's my daughter?" "You should rest now. The doctors will speak with you when you're feeling better." Sarah tried to sit up, but leather restraints held her wrists to the bed rails. Panic flooded through her system, burning away the effects of the sedative. "Where is my daughter?" she screamed. The nurse pressed a call button, and within minutes, 2 orderlies appeared. They were followed by a doctor Sarah had never seen before. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Williams. You're at Pine Valley Psychiatric Hospital. You were admitted following a severe episode of postpartum psychosis." "I'm not psychotic. I want to see my baby." "Your infant is being well cared for. Right now, we need to focus on your recovery." "How long have I been here?" 3 days. Sarah's heart stopped. 3 days. Anything could have happened to her daughter in 3 days. "I want to call my lawyer. Of course, when you're feeling better, we can discuss your legal options. But right now, your husband has made the difficult decision to seek temporary guardianship of your child." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. David had used her brief stay in the psychiatric hospital to gain legal custody of their daughter. "I want to see the guardianship papers." "Mrs. Mitchell, you need to focus on getting well. Everything else can be sorted out later." But Sarah knew there might not be a later. If David succeeded in having her declared permanently incompetent, she would never see her daughter again. As the doctor and nurses left her alone, Sarah began planning her escape. She had to find her daughter before David's web of lies became permanently entangled with the legal system. But first, she had to convince everyone around her that she wasn't crazy, a nearly impossible task when she was strapped to a bed in a psychiatric hospital, separated from her newborn child and surrounded by David's carefully constructed evidence of her mental instability. Sarah spent the next week learning the rhythms of Pine Valley Psychiatric Hospital. She quickly realized that protesting her sanity too loudly would only reinforce the narrative that she was delusional. Instead, she began playing a more subtle game. During group therapy sessions, she listened more than she spoke. She observed how the genuinely ill patients behaved versus those who, like her, might have been committed for reasons other than mental illness. There were more of the latter than she'd expected. Her therapist was Dr. Monica Chen, a woman in her 40s who seemed more genuine than the other medical professionals Sarah had encountered recently. "Tell me about the night your daughter was born," Dr. Chen said during their 3rd session. "I went into premature labor at an isolated cabin. My husband's girlfriend pretended to be a nurse and refused to call for help." "That's quite an accusation. What evidence do you have?" Sarah had learned not to mention the credit card statement, which had disappeared from her belongings. Instead, she focused on verifiable facts. "Check David's phone records. Look at the fertility clinic charges on his credit card. Investigate Amber Hayes' nursing credentials." Dr. Chen made careful notes. "I'll look into what you've told me. But Sarah, I need you to consider the possibility that your perceptions may have been affected by the stress of a high-risk pregnancy. My perceptions are fine. My husband is a sociopath who's trying to steal my child. The words sounded crazy, even to Sarah's own ears. She could see Dr. Chen adding another note to her file. Let's talk about your brother, Jake. Dr. Chen continued. Your husband says he expressed concerns about your mental state. Jake would never betray me unless David got to him somehow. Got to him how? Sarah paused. She had no evidence that David had bribed or threatened Jake, but she knew her brother, and his apparent betrayal made no sense unless he was being manipulated. I don't know, but Jake wouldn't side with David against me unless something was very wrong. That afternoon, Sarah was allowed a supervised phone call. She chose to call Jake, hoping to understand what had happened. Sarah! Jake's voice was strained. How are you feeling? I'm feeling like my husband had me committed to steal our baby. What did you tell David about our conversation? A long pause. Sarah, you called me in the middle of the night making wild accusations. I was concerned about you. So you decided to help David take my child away. I didn't help anyone. I just answered honestly when David asked if you'd been acting strangely. Sarah could hear something in her brother's voice, guilt, fear, or both. Jake, what did David offer you? I don't know what you mean. Money, a story. What was worth betraying your sister for? Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly. And when I prove David orchestrated this whole thing, I'll remember who stood with me and who didn't. She hung up, more convinced than ever that David had somehow compromised her brother. That evening, during visiting hours, Sarah was shocked to see an unexpected visitor, Carol Mitchell, David's mother. The elderly woman entered Sarah's room with the regal bearing that came from generations of old Boston money. Hello, Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell. I'm surprised to see you. Carol sat in the plastic visitor's chair, her designer handbag placed carefully on her lap. I wanted to see how you're doing. How do you think I'm doing? Your son had me committed so he could steal my baby. That's quite an accusation. It's the truth. Carol studied Sarah's face for a long moment. Tell me about Amber Hayes. The question surprised Sarah. You know about Amber. I know David has been distracted lately. I assumed there was another woman. Sarah stared at her mother-in-law, trying to understand why Carol was here. In 7 years of marriage, they'd never had a personal conversation. Amber posed as a nurse and helped David trap me. She was there when our daughter was born. Yes, I heard about the unusual circumstances of the birth. They let my daughter be born without proper medical care. She could have died. Carol's expression remained neutral, but Sarah detected something flickering beneath the surface. Where is the child now? I don't know. David won't tell me, and no one here will give me information. She's with David at the penthouse, Carol said quietly, being cared for by a legitimate nanny. How do you know? Because I hired the nanny myself. Sarah blinked in surprise. Why would you do that? Carol stood, smoothing her skirt. Because regardless of what I think of you, that child is my granddaughter. After Carol left, Sarah lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling. David's mother had just revealed that she knew more about the situation than she'd let on. But whether Carol was an ally or another enemy remained to be seen. The next morning brought another surprise. Dr. Chen entered Sarah's room with a thick file folder. I did some investigating based on our conversations, she said. You were right about several things. Sarah sat up straighter. What did you find? Amber Hayes is not a licensed nurse in Massachusetts. The fertility clinic charges on your husband's credit card are real, and your brother received a payment of $50,000 from your husband's business account 3 days before you were admitted here. Sarah felt vindicated and heartbroken at the same time. She'd been right about everything, but the betrayal by her own brother was devastating. So what happens now? Now we build a case to get you released and reunited with your daughter. But Sarah, you need to be prepared. David has had over a week to solidify his legal position. This isn't going to be easy. For the first time since entering Pine Valley, Sarah felt hope. She had an ally who believed her, and evidence that could support her claims. But as she'd learned repeatedly over the past months, hope was a dangerous thing when dealing with someone as calculating as David Mitchell. Dr. Chen's investigation had uncovered more than just the financial evidence. Over the following days, she presented Sarah with a disturbing picture of David's methodical planning. The fertility clinic charges weren't for Amber, Dr. Chen revealed during a private session. They were for fertility drugs that would induce early labor. Sarah's blood ran cold. He drugged me. The blood work we ran when you were admitted shows traces of prostaglandins drugs used to induce labor. Someone had been giving them to you gradually, probably in your food or vitamins. That's why I went into labor early. David poisoned me. It appears so, but proving it in court will be challenging. The drugs are metabolized quickly, and the levels in your system could be explained by natural labor. Sarah felt sick thinking about all the meals David had prepared for her, all the vitamins he'd insisted she take for the baby's health. Every act of apparent care had been designed to harm her. There's more, Dr. Chen continued. I contacted the medical board about Dr. Harrison. He was sanctioned last year for falsifying psychiatric evaluations in custody cases. David bought him. It seems likely. The board is reopening their investigation. Sarah allowed herself to feel a moment of hope, but it was quickly crushed by her next question. How is my daughter? According to the nanny your mother-in-law hired, she's healthy and thriving. But Sarah, David has filed for permanent custody. The hearing is scheduled for next week. Can I be there? Not unless we can get you released first, and that depends on convincing a judge that your original commitment was fraudulent. That afternoon, Sarah received another unexpected visitor, Jake. He entered her room, looking haggard and guilty, unable to meet her eyes. I know you probably don't want to see me, he began. You took $50,000 to betray me. Jake flinched as if she'd hit him. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Her brother sat heavily in the visitor's chair, his usual confidence completely absent. David threatened me. Sarah. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure I lost my job, my apartment, everything. So you chose to protect yourself instead of me? I chose to protect you the only way I could. I took his money and his threats, but I've been investigating him this whole time. Jake pulled a flash drive from his pocket. I've been recording every conversation with David. I have evidence of him bribing Dr. Harrison, planning your commitment, and discussing how to permanently separate you from your daughter. Sarah stared at the flash drive, hardly daring to believe it. You were working undercover. I'm a journalist, Sarah. When someone tries to bribe me, I start digging. David has no idea how much evidence I've gathered against him. Why didn't you tell me? Because if you knew, you might have acted differently. David needed to believe he had complete control. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, vindication, and love for her brother who had risked everything to protect her. What's on the recordings? Everything. David admitting to drugging you, planning the fake emergency at the cabin, bribing officials to have you committed, and Sarah Amber isn't his mistress. What do you mean? She's his half-sister. David's father had an affair 26 years ago. Amber is working with David to claim the family inheritance that would normally go to any legitimate grandchildren. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Our daughter is the only thing standing between them and inheriting Carol's entire estate. If they can prove you're unfit and get you permanently committed, David becomes the child's sole guardian and inheritor. Sarah understood now why Carol had visited her, why she'd hired the nanny herself. David's own mother was a target in this scheme. Does Carol know? I don't think so. But I think she suspects something. That's why she's been protecting your daughter. We have to warn her. We will, but first, we need to get you out of here. Jake handed her the flash drive. Dr. Chen is working with a lawyer who specializes in wrongful commitments. Between the evidence she's gathered and my recordings, we should be able to get you released within 48 hours. What about my daughter? The custody hearing has been postponed due to new evidence coming to light. You'll have a chance to fight for her. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she might actually win, but she knew David well enough to understand that he wouldn't go down without a fight. The final confrontation was still ahead of them. That evening, as she lay in her hospital bed clutching Jake's flash drive, Sarah began planning not just her escape from Pine Valley, but her strategy for destroying David's carefully constructed lies and reclaiming her daughter. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. Sarah's release from Pine Valley came at dawn on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after her daughter's birth. Dr. Chen had worked with attorney Maria Santos to present a compelling case that Sarah's commitment had been fraudulent, supported by Jake's recordings and the medical evidence of induced labor. But freedom came with a devastating revelation: David had disappeared with their daughter. He took her yesterday, Carol Mitchell explained as they stood in the empty penthouse. Claimed he was taking her for a medical checkup, but the nanny said he had suitcases packed. Sarah stared at the nursery David had apparently set up a perfect room that her daughter had barely occupied. Everything was pristine, expensive, and completely lacking in warmth. Do we know where he went? I've hired a private investigator, Carol said. David cleared out his business accounts and terminated his lease agreements. This was planned well in advance. Sarah sank into the rocking chair that had been intended for her to use with her daughter, 3 weeks old, and the baby had been living with strangers, moved constantly, with no stable attachment to anyone. There's something else, Carol continued. I had my attorneys look into David's financial situation. He's been embezzling from his own company to fund this scheme. When the authorities catch him, he'll face federal charges. I don't care about the money, Sarah said. I just want my daughter back. Jake entered the nursery carrying his laptop. I may have found them. He showed Sarah a social media post from Amber Hayes, taken at what appeared to be a beach resort. In the background of her selfie, barely visible, was David holding an infant car seat. The metadata shows this was posted from the Cayman Islands 6 hours ago. Sarah studied the image, her heart breaking at the glimpse of her daughter in David's arms. The baby looked healthy, but she was being held by people who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. The Caymans don't have an extradition treaty for custody cases, Maria Santos explained over the phone. But they do for financial crimes. If we can prove David embezzled money to fund his escape, we might be able to get him arrested. Carol stepped forward. I can help with that. David has been stealing from the family trust for months. I have all the documentation. Sarah looked at her mother-in-law with new understanding. You knew all along, didn't you? I suspected David was up to something when he suddenly became interested in the family inheritance. When you were committed, I started my own investigation. Why didn't you help me sooner? Carol's expression was pained. Because I wasn't sure if you were actually ill or if David was manipulating everyone. I needed to be certain before I acted. And now you're certain. Now I know my son is capable of things I never imagined, including kidnapping his own child to steal her inheritance. Jake was already on his laptop, working with law enforcement contacts to coordinate David's arrest. But Sarah knew that even if they caught him, the damage to her daughter might already be done. A 3-week-old baby needs stability, routine, bonding, Sarah said. Every day she's with them is harmful to her development. Which is why we're going to get her back, Carol said with steely determination. David may be my son, but that child is my granddaughter. Within hours, they had a coordinated plan. Jake would work with federal authorities to issue warrants for David's arrest on embezzlement charges. Carol would use her connections to expedite the legal process in the Cayman Islands. Sarah would fly to Grand Cayman with Maria Santos to be ready to take custody of her daughter the moment David was arrested. But as they prepared to leave Boston, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that David had one more surprise waiting for them. He'd been planning this scheme for months, maybe longer. Someone that calculating wouldn't be taken down easily. Her fears were confirmed when they arrived in Grand Cayman and discovered that David and Amber had already moved on. The hotel confirmed they'd checked out that morning. Destination unknown. He's monitoring us somehow, Sarah realized. He knows we're here. Jake checked his phone and cursed. He's using social media to track our movements. Look. He showed Sarah posts from various people in Boston mentioning her release from the hospital, their trip to the penthouse, even their flight to Grand Cayman. David was following their every move through other people's innocent posts. So he's always going to be one step ahead, Sarah said, despair creeping into her voice. Not necessarily, Carol said, pulling out her own phone. David may be tech-savvy, but he's still predictable. I know my son. Carol made a call that Sarah couldn't quite hear, speaking in low, urgent tones. When she hung up, she had a grim smile on her face. David is going to need money to keep running. I've just frozen every account, credit line, and trust fund he has access to. He'll surface within 48 hours looking for cash. What if he hurts the baby when he realizes he's trapped? He won't, Carol said with certainty. Because the baby is the only leverage he has left. As long as he has her, he thinks he can still win. Sarah prayed Carol was right, but she couldn't forget the cold look in David's eyes when their daughter was born. David saw his child as a problem to be solved, not a person to be protected. As they waited for David to make his next move, Sarah prepared for what might be her final chance to save her daughter from the man who was supposed to love them both. The call came at 4 a.m, 46 hours after Carol had frozen David's accounts. He was in Miami, attempting to withdraw money from a bank account Carol's investigators had been monitoring. He's trapped, Jake told Sarah over the phone. No money, no resources, and a baby who needs constant care. The FBI is moving in now. Sarah was already dressed and ready to fly to Miami. She'd been living in a hotel room near the Grand Cayman airport, afraid to go anywhere that might delay her response when David was finally located. The flight to Miami felt endless. Sarah spent the entire time imagining worst-case scenarios David might have hurt her daughter when he realized he was caught, or abandoned her somewhere, or worse. By the time they landed, Sarah was barely holding herself together. Maria Santos met them at the airport with news both good and devastating. David has been arrested on federal embezzlement charges. Your daughter is safe and has been taken to Miami Children's Hospital for evaluation. What's wrong with her? Sarah's voice cracked with fear. She's malnourished and dehydrated. It appears she hasn't been properly fed in several days. Sarah's knees nearly gave out. while she'd been trapped in a psychiatric hospital and then searching for her child. Her daughter had been suffering from neglect. "Can I see her?" "Yes, but Sarah, you need to prepare yourself. She's very small and weak." The drive to the hospital was a blur. Sarah's mind was focused entirely on her daughter, the child she'd held for only minutes before David's scheme had torn them apart. Miami Children's Hospital was a maze of corridors and waiting rooms, but Sarah barely noticed her surroundings. All she could think about was reaching her daughter. The NICU was a hushed, high-tech environment where tiny patients fought for life, surrounded by machines and monitors. Sarah's daughter was in bed number 7, connected to IVs and feeding tubes, but she was breathing on her own and her eyes were open. "She's going to be fine," the attending physician assured Sarah. "Babies are remarkably resilient. A few days of proper nutrition and she'll be ready to go home." Sarah approached the bed slowly, hardly daring to believe she was finally going to hold her daughter again. The baby was tinier than Sarah remembered, but her eyes were alert and seemed to focus on Sarah's face. "Hello, sweet girl," Sarah whispered, gently touching her daughter's tiny hand. "Mommy's here now." The baby's fingers wrapped around Sarah's, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something other than fear and desperation. She felt love, pure and overwhelming. "What did they name her?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing she didn't even know what her daughter had been called during their separation. "According to the paperwork, Jane Doe," the nurse said gently. "They never filed proper birth certificate documents." Sarah felt a fresh wave of anger at David's callousness, but she pushed it aside. Her daughter needed her complete attention now. "Her name is Emma," Sarah said firmly. "Emma Rose Mitchell." Over the next 3 days, Sarah rarely left Emma's side. She fed her, held her, talked to her constantly, trying to rebuild the bond that David's scheme had severed. Emma was responsive and seemed to recognize Sarah's voice, which the doctors said was a good sign. Carol arrived on the 2nd day, bringing an expensive stroller and bags of baby clothes. "I thought Emma might need some proper things," she said, studying her granddaughter with undisguised love. "Thank you," Sarah said, "for everything. If you hadn't helped, David is my son, but what he did was unforgivable." Carol interrupted. "This child deserves better than the legacy of lies and manipulation he tried to create for her." On the 3rd day, Jake brought news about the legal resolution. David has been charged with embezzlement, kidnapping, conspiracy, and fraud. He's looking at 25 years minimum. Amber is cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. "What about my commitment? The fake medical evaluations? Dr. Harrison's medical license has been revoked, and he's facing criminal charges. Pine Valley Hospital is conducting a full review of their intake procedures. You'll likely receive a substantial settlement." Sarah barely cared about the money or even David's punishment. All that mattered was Emma, who was gaining weight steadily and would soon be healthy enough to leave the hospital. "There's one more thing," Jake said. "Amber wants to see you. She says she has something to tell you about David's plans." Sarah found Amber in the county jail, looking nothing like the polished woman who had pretended to be a nurse. She was pale, exhausted, and clearly frightened. "I'm sorry," Amber said immediately. "I know that doesn't mean anything, but I need you to know I never wanted to hurt the baby." "Then why did you help him?" "Because David convinced me you were genuinely mentally ill and that Emma would be better off without you. He showed me medical records, recordings of you talking to yourself, evidence that seemed to prove you were dangerous." Sarah realized David had been manipulating Amber as much as everyone else, using her own traumatic childhood to make her believe she was protecting Emma. "There's something else," Amber continued. David had a backup plan if he was caught. He told me he'd rather see Emma dead than let you raise her. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? He said if everything fell apart, he'd make sure you never got her back. I thought it was just angry talk, but after seeing what he's capable of... Sarah stood to leave, but Amber called after her. He hired someone in Boston. I don't know who or for what, but he made a call the night before we left Grand Cayman. He said his insurance policy was in place. Sarah ran from the jail straight to the hospital, her heart pounding with fresh terror. David might be in custody, but if he'd arranged for something to happen to Emma... She found the NICU in lockdown. Security guards stood at every entrance, and police were questioning staff members. What's happening? Sarah demanded. Someone tried to gain access to your daughter's room, the head nurse explained. A man claiming to be Emma's grandfather, but he couldn't provide proper identification. Sarah's legs went weak with relief and terror. David's final gambit had failed, but just barely. Is Emma safe? She's fine. We've arranged for additional security until you can take her home. That afternoon, as Sarah sat holding Emma in the rocking chair beside her hospital bed, Carol appeared with Jake and Maria Santos. It's over, Maria announced. David's associate has been arrested, and we've obtained a restraining order that will keep anyone connected to David away from you and Emma permanently. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. Emma had survived David's scheme, neglect, and abandonment, and she was going to be fine. When can we go home? Sarah asked. Tomorrow morning, the doctor said. Emma has gained enough weight and shown enough progress. She's ready to start her real life. That evening, as Sarah prepared to spend their last night in the hospital, she reflected on everything they'd been through. David had tried to steal Emma's inheritance, her mother, and her future. He'd nearly succeeded. But Emma was a survivor, just like her mother. And tomorrow, they would begin building the life David had tried to destroy, a life built on love, truth, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. As Emma slept in her arms, Sarah whispered promises about the future they would share together, far away from the shadows of David's manipulation and lies. They had won, not just the legal battle, but the war for Emma's soul. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt hope that was real, solid, and unshakable. Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma rebuilt their lives with the support of Carol Mitchell, who established a trust fund to ensure Emma's future security and education. Sarah used her settlement money to create a foundation helping women escape abusive relationships and fraudulent medical commitments. Jake's investigation into the case led to reforms in psychiatric intake procedures and judicial oversight of emergency custody decisions. David Mitchell was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Amber Hayes served 18 months and now works with Sarah's foundation, using her experience to help other women recognize and escape manipulation. Emma grew up healthy, loved, and surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, not what she represented. The inheritance that had motivated so much pain became a tool for healing, funding programs that protected other families from experiencing what they had endured. Sometimes the most profound victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from refusing to let their darkness define our future.